Jean Baudrillard's postmodernist take on Marxism. Jean Baudrillard is known as a postmodernist philosopher. He began his academic career as an out-and-out Marxist, but later rebelled against Marxism. Yet, like Marx himself and his relation to Hegel, Baudrillard would have been nothing without Marxism. He bounced off Marx's work. He used Marx's technical terms. He was essentially parasitical on Marxism. Yet Baudrillard also believed that he'd transcended Marxism as a whole. The argument in this essay is that, in many ways, he didn't. Most of Baudrillard's quoted words in this essay come from his book, Symbolic Exchange and Death. In concrete biographical terms, Jean Baudrillard wrote his doctoral thesis on the consumer society from a Marxist point of view. He was also once a member of the Socialismo Barbari Socialism or Barbarism group. This group, which existed in France from the 1940s to the late 1960s, offered a revolutionary route toward socialism. The following is the World Socialist website on Baudrillard. Baudrillard became a teaching assistant in September 1966 at Nanterre University in Paris. As the student revolt swept Paris in 1968, Baudrillard sympathized with the radical students at his university and cooperated with the journal Die Utopie, which espoused anarchist theories spiced by quasi-Marxist phraseology. Following the betrayal of the workers and student revolts by the French Communist Party and the ebbing of a wave of radicalism across Europe, Baudrillard joined a growing number of French intellectuals who sought to rapidly ditch their radical pasts. Jean Baudrillard defines Marxism. It's helpful that Baudrillard spelt out what Marxism is, or what he took it to be, in a rare bit of clear prose. He wrote, "The critique of political economy begins with social production or the mode of production as its reference. The concept of production alone allows us, by means of an analysis of that unique commodity called labor power, to extract a surplus value, which controls the rational dynamics of capital, as it's beyond the revolution." It's hard to say what Marxists will make of that simple account, but it seems correct to me. But note how Baudrillard slipped in the out-of-place technical term reference into his account. He did so to prepare the way for his later stress on reference or referential systems. See how Jean Baudrillard, the philosopher, tried to annihilate the world. In any case, perhaps the precise Marxist details don't matter because Baudrillard went on to argue that today everything has changed again. In what way? In this way. Production, the commodity form, labor power, equivalence and surplus value, which together form the outline of a quantitative, material and measurable configuration, are now things of the past. Even a non-Marxist would deem this categorical claim about production, labor power, etc. being things of the past to be incredible. However, if you buy into Baudrillard's total philosophical vision, then it kind of makes sense. At least Baudrillard's account of Marxism shows the quantitative and measurable, therefore scientific, nature of old-style Marxism. This account would fit well in a beginner's book on Marxist economics. Baudrillard's point was that there is more to the game than production, labor power, and surplus value. Marxists would agree with that. Yet Marxists would still have argued that production, labor power, and surplus value are the essential core of capitalism. Now that's what Baudrillard had a problem with. To him, the system of signs is at the core of capitalism. In other words, the Marxist superstructure is at the heart of capitalism. Or, to use Baudrillard's own words, what we now have is the metamorphosis of capital under the sign of the structural law of value. Isn't this a simple inversion of Marx's categories on Baudrillard's part? Jean Baudrillard, as a non-Marxist radical. Baudrillard was attempting to outdo Marxists. He explicitly stated that he wanted to discover the rule of the game in order to destroy the logical network of the agencies of capital, however. Baudrillard also wanted to discover the rule of the game of the Marxian categories, which analyze it too. Why so? It was because Baudrillard believed that Marxian categories are again only an appearance at the second degree of capital, its critical appearance. Baudrillard even stated that the revolution shouldn't be staked on the mode of production or the commodity law of value. It should be staked on signs. But this wasn't simply to make socialism more radical, because Baudrillard's position or the state of affairs in his day wasn't a socialist outcome. Oh dear. All this is very hard to interpret. It suggests that Marxian categories are as much a part of capital as the explicit defenses of capital. To Baudrillard, even though Marxists were critical of capitalism, they, or their words, are still an appearance of capitalism. This parallels Derrida's admission that he had to work within the syntax and system of Western metaphysics even when he was deconstructing Western metaphysics. See Derrida's 1967 groundwork for the destruction of Western metaphysics. Similarly, Marxists must work with the domain of capitalism even when they're offering critiques of capitalism. In an obvious sense, then, it's true that Marxists live and breathe within capitalist states and societies. But did Baudrillard mean more than that? Well, perhaps only in the sense that he focused on such things as signification, signs, hyperreality, etc. Marx's substructure. According to Baudrillard, Marx believed that production is everything. He went on to say that art, religion, and duty have no real history for Marx. Instead, only production has a history, or rather, it is said history. It grounds history. Yet, according to Baudrillard, labor is an incredible fabrication. Baudrillard basically argued that Marx had set up a new philosophical reality appearance distinction between production and its epiphenomena, that is, art, religion, and duty. That seems right. After all, one of the reasons why Marxists today don't have anything critical to say about Islamism is that they deem it to be a mere epiphenomenon of, if not of production, then of the evils of Western capitalism. In other words, Islamism is nothing but a necessary response to what the capitalist West has done in Muslim countries. See here. According to Baudrillard's Marx, production is an original process, the process at the origin of all others. To Baudrillard, on the other hand, production and labor constitute a particular phase in the order of signs. Baudrillard believed that Marx essentialized labor and production, as well as surplus value, etc. So did Baudrillard do the same to art, religion, signs, media, advertising, etc. It wasn't just religion that was deemed to be an epiphenomenon or part of the superstructure. Baudrillard picked up on the other things which contemporary Marxists deemed to be epiphenomena too. To Baudrillard, epiphenomena are reality, or at least they're what's important when it comes to capitalism. In Baudrillard's own words, "Today we know that it is at the level of reproduction, fashion, the media, advertising, information and communication networks, at the level of what Marx rather carelessly used to call the faux phrase of capital, immense historical irony, that is, in the sphere of simulacra and the code, that the unity of the whole process of capital is formed. Thus, the causal arrow in Marxism is from production or capital to fashion, the media, advertising, etc., whereas to Baudrillard, the arrow is from fashion, the media, advertising, etc. to not capital or production, but to everything. It may be argued that Baudrillard simply negated the arrow rather than inverted it, but that's hard to see. Simulacra really do take the position of Marx's means of production or substructure in Baudrillard's postmodernist philosophy. After all, Baudrillard went on to say that the real message, the real ultimatum, lay in reproduction itself. Indeed, simulacra prevail over history. That said, some readers may well see how the media, advertising, information, and communication networks, if not fashion, do indeed constitute the unity of the whole process of capital. Yet wouldn't the solution to this arrow of causation simply be to see it with two equal arrow points, rather than with one or its inversion? Indeed, isn't this how Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, etc. saw things? See cultural Marxism, labor and production. Basically, Baudrillard believed that the main problem with Marxism is not its claims to truth or to a scientific status, something which is hardly stressed at all by contemporary Marxists, but its philosophical realism. Here's Baudrillard laying out the old order of designation and reality. In the past, labor was used to designate the reality of a social production and a social objective of accumulating wealth. Even capital and surplus value exploited it. Instead of this Marxist reality, Baudrillard argued that we really have an immense ritual of the signs of labor which extends over society in general. That's because labor reproduces itself. Labor doesn't produce anything, or less strongly, it matters little whether or not it produces. Clearly, readers now need to know what Baudrillard meant by the word reproduces and how it ties to labor. Baudrillard believed that talk of the workers, production, and class consciousness was really all about image and rhetoric. To him, labor is much more effective to socialize by means of rituals and signs than by the bound energies of production. Baudrillard probably had in mind red flags, May Day celebrations, socialist anthems, socialist iconography, etc. Labor and workers are asked only to become socialized, not to produce. Basically, workers are brought into the capitalist system of signs without any problem whatsoever, like punk and before that, hippie culture. The rituals of trade unions, activists, rhetoric, etc. are all accommodated or socialized by das System. Baudrillard played down labor or the substructure again when he said it has become one sign amongst many. But what follows is hard to decipher. He told his readers that labor is exchanged against non-labor, leisure, in accordance with a total equivalence. It is commutable with every other sector of life. Thus, a Marxist can agree with the statement that labor is exchanged against non-labor, But he won't be happy with the last claim that it's commutable with every other sector of life too. The reference to total equivalence that is outside systems of signs is something that Baudrillard was suspicious of, partly because it seems to be a matter of metaphysics and faith that there can be such a thing as total equivalence, regardless if labor is paid very well or very badly. However, wasn't Baudrillard correct to argue that seeing production and labor as the ultimate metaphysical substructure amounts to metaphysical nonsense? Anyway, in line with all this, Baudrillard went on to say that labor is no more or less alienated. It is no longer a unique historical praxis giving rise to unique social relations. Instead, labor is now only a set of signing operations. Readers can agree with large parts of Baudrillard's critique of Marxism, yet not also endorse his stress on, in this case, signing operations. In other words, his critique of Marxism may stand apart from his postmodernist stress on signs, hyperreality, etc. Baudrillard's fans, on the other hand, may say that the two come together. Technology and production. Now take this passage. Walter Benjamin was also the first, with McLuhan after him, to grasp technology as a medium rather than a productive force, at which point the Marxian analysis retreats. Why can't technology be the result of production, be involved in production, and also be a medium presumably of information, messages, etc.? Why the binarism from Baudrillard? In addition, readers can accept that technology is a result of production, etc., without also relying on any Marxian analysis. Marx did well to focus on production, but Baudrillard, in his own binary manner, simply erased it, or at least he interpreted it in such a way that it becomes something hardly anyone else would recognize. Baudrillard then claimed that technology is now the form and principle of an entirely new generation of meaning. So do Baudrillard's own words constitute an entirely new generation of meaning? Of course, Baudrillard's fans and defenders would say that the meaning is dependent on the context of all the other words which surround it, and much else. But that way in can't be guaranteed either. And let's not forget that it's written into symbolic exchange and death that Baudrillard didn't need to argue his case or provide evidence. Instead, we have a simulacrum of philosophy that's all style, exaggeration, poeticism, generalization, and hype. The most charitable take would be to say that technology is responsible for producing an entirely new generation of meaning. But Baudrillard simply didn't say that. The best Baudrillard could do by way of an explanation or justification was to claim that. The mere fact that any given thing can simply be reproduced, and one need only think of the stupefaction of the black boy seeing two identical books for the first time. Was Baudrillard a linguistic idealist? I am not sure that we have now transcended and left behind modernity, class politics, labor and production, imperialism, fascism, and the other phenomena described by classical and neo-Marxism. Critical theorist and Marxist Douglas Kellner has found in his book Jean Baudrillard, From Marxism to Postmodernism and Beyond. One term for Baudrillard's philosophy is linguistic idealism. Of course, it's not a perfect term. However, take this statement. Labor is not a power, it has become one sign amongst many. Elsewhere, Baudrillard stated that, beyond the dialectics of industry, trade and finance, beyond the dialectics of class which is held in its productive phase, a symbolic violence inscribed everywhere in signs, even in the signs of the revolution. Of course, there are symbols and signs. And some of these symbols and signs refer to industry, trade, finance, and class. But how are these concrete things factored out by Baudrillard's analysis? How do these symbols and signs become autonomous? How does reference literally drop out of the picture? How and when did the real becomes the hyper-real? As for labor is not a power, it has become one sign amongst many. Here Baudrillard's binarism reveals itself again. Why can't labor be power and be a sign of whatever at the same time? Why such categorical claims from Baudrillard? In terms of Baudrillard's stress on signs, he noted that Marx was still in the golden age of the dialectic of the sign and the real. This is odd because Marx himself stressed the difference between superstructure and substructure. However, this would have been problematic to Baudrillard because to Marx the substructure would have been the real, and the superstructure would be a kind of appearance. Thus, Baudrillard simply inverted the order by saying that superstructure is now the real. In other words, what Marx took to be epiphenomena, religion, ideology, art, the media, etc., Baudrillard deemed to be the real. Except, of course, Baudrillard never really said that the superstructure is the real or anything like that. Indeed, if he had done so, then he would have shown his readers that he was playing the same old game,